I'm Coach Tara Foster, safe powerboat handling instructor and safety and rescue boat handling instructor. I'm here today to answer your questions from the internet. This is Boat Support. All right, first up, Studio Barker asks, why do ships use port and starboard instead of left and right? When you're on a boat, if you're talking to someone who's right in front of you, their left is gonna be opposite of your left, which means that if they need you to grab something really quickly, if there's an emergency or a problem, you need to have a common language for directions. So when we're talking about a boat, we wanna refer to the left side as port in reference to the bow and stern, and then the right side would be starboard. So that way, even if someone's facing the back of the boat and someone else is facing the front of the boat, they're both able to refer to the same side at the same time. Tension LLC asks, how do I tie a cleat hitch? A cleat hitch is one of the most common knots that we need to be able to tie when we're out boating. And a cleat that you're most commonly gonna see is this one. It's a horn cleat. So when we go to tie a cleat hitch, we wanna tie an O and then an 8. And then as you go to complete the 8, what we're gonna do is essentially twist it under. This is called a half hitch. So we're gonna lock this half hitch on and pull tight, and that is your cleat hitch. Good way to make sure you've tied it correctly is there should be 2 rivers under a bridge. The Scuba News asks, where does the term MAYDAY come from? So MAYDAY is actually in reference to a French word, and I'm probably gonna mispronounce it slightly here, MAYDAY, which means help me. Severe Taylor 8962 asks, how do you master docking and undocking? I can actually show you that now. One of the big things to keep in mind is slow is going to be your best friend when you're approaching a dock. You always wanna make sure you're at minimum control speed, which means you're just adjusting between idle forward, neutral, and idle reverse as needed to essentially slowly maneuver your boat into the dock. Slow is pro. As I get in a little closer here, I want to make sure that my fenders are ready for my approach to the dock. Small controlled thrust movements are going to be key as I bring my boat in safely to the dock. I just want to make sure I come in at a nice, easy pace. I'm able to get myself successfully tied off. Now, what I'm looking to do here is essentially tie off the line that's going to be doing the most amount of work first. The breeze pushing against the bow of my boat is essentially going to create more work on that line because it's pushing force against it. I want to tie that one off first because I need it to hold me in. I'll tie off my stern second. Once I'm firmly secured to the dock, I can go back and turn my engine off. Always make sure that your engine doesn't go off until you're firmly secured. It does take a little bit of practice to get docking right. So make sure you're in an area where you won't damage yourself or others, and pick a nice calm day to get your practice in. Secret Santa asks, worst boat name imaginable? I don't know if there's one that specifically comes to mind, but any boat name that you would be hesitant to call a Mayday for is probably one that I would second guess. And if you have a better one, tell me in the comments. Jacko Talltails asks, how would you deal with a man overboard situation? First things first, call it out really loudly. Make sure you point, man overboard. And the reason why you would want to do that is because you need to make sure that any other boaters in the area are aware that there's now someone in the water that they need to avoid and not hit. The next big step is to make sure that you are throttling down, so that way you're not going at high speeds. So that way you regain control of the boat and can safely turn around to reapproach the person. Take essentially a big O turn around and approach coming bow into the breeze. The reason why you want to approach bow to breeze is that they're blown towards you and you're not blown on top of them. And then the last big piece of it is please do not reverse back towards them. That is putting them close to your prop and puts them and you in a very dangerous situation. Always make sure you're approaching in forward, and as you get closer to them, you're going to want to bring the engine back into neutral, so that way the prop is not spinning. The last thing we want to do is have a spinning prop near a human in the water. Drew to Read asks, nautical knots, what do I need to know? There are a ton of really useful knots, but some of the most common and most useful ones would be something like a bowline. The way we teach it, we tell it with a story. So we've got a tree, and we've got a hole at the bottom of the tree, and the other end of your line is a rabbit. The rabbit's gonna come up the hole, around the base of the tree, and dive back into the hole. And basically what it should look like at the end is a little life jacket around a stick, pulled tight, and that is how you create a really lovely, strong loop. So this can be put over a piling or hung around something if you need to hang something up. Another really useful knot is a stopper knot. So a stopper knot stops a line from sliding through something. Another little story to remember it by is you make a snowman, you put his scarf around, and you pop his carrot nose in. and then you have a figure 8. And what that'll do is it'll stop the line from sliding through. These knots are really useful because they're easy to do what we call break. So they come undone very quickly. They have little loops that help them come undone. And it doesn't put a ton of stress on the inside of the line, which is the core of the line. When you tie something like a simple overhand knot, what that does is it puts a lot of stress on the line, and any knot will actually decrease the strength of your line as a whole. So what ends up happening then is you increase the risk of breakage. The other thing we want to avoid with an overhand knot is under a lot of stress or a big load, what'll end up happening is this becomes so tight, it almost becomes impossible to undo because it doesn't have a good break point. So I'd avoid those overhand knots and try something else instead. Reddit user asks, why is speed measured in knots when on a boat or a plane, and why is distance measured in nautical miles? The way they used to measure speed was they would literally tie knots in a line and send it overboard, and they'd see how fast they'd move in comparison to those knots. When the knots became a really standard set distance, that was kind of the standard for measuring speed of a boat. Nautical miles are based off that distance of knots. So 1 knot is 1.15 miles per hour. The Frank Meister 4815 asks, is there anything I can do to increase maneuverability? One of the best tools to increase your maneuverability and your understanding of how to best maneuver your boat is to master something called the pivot turn. And I can show you that now. So the pivot turn utilizes small amount of forward and reverse thrust to essentially pivot your boat on a point. One of the biggest things to keep in mind is that you want the breeze to help you. So right now I'm utilizing the breeze coming this way to help push my bow down. And because all the thrust in this boat's coming from the stern, what I'm doing is trying to get my stern then, where the heavier thrust is, turned up into the breeze. Constantly checking my 360, making sure that I'm not getting near anything that could damage my boat or anybody around me. I'm only going into gear once my engine is fully turned over. And that'll let me turn a full 180, or if I need to, a full 360. What ends up happening is you're able to spin, decreasing your turning radius to 0 when you've got good control over it. Loafed1 asks, should I go faster or slower in choppy waters? You never want to go super fast unless you want a very bumpy ride that risks injuring yourself and anyone else on board. But going too slow can also put you at the mercy of the waves around you. When you're going down a wave, especially if it's a bigger wave, you want to make sure that you're not going too fast because your bow, the front of your boat, will slam into the next wave and you'll submarine. If you go too slow, you run the risk of the wave just carrying you. So you need to make sure that you're reacting to the waves with the type of boat that you have. Unnecessary Jibe asks, what do you do when your anchor is completely stuck? It can be really frustrating when you're outboating, you anchor for a while, and then you go to pull your anchor up and it's stuck. One of the first things you want to make sure you do is you've moved your boat to be directly on top of your anchor point. Basically, what you want to do is help lift that back end of your anchor so it becomes directly up, which will help get it unstuck. The next thing I would do is maybe start to swivel around. Be careful as you do that though, and make sure there's nothing in your way as you swivel around it, because that can help free it. You wanna make sure that you're not gonna run anything over. Make sure you're still keeping a good lookout for other boats around you. Coastal Near asks, what is with the hate for pontoons? I think the hate for pontoons comes from the fact that they're essentially like taking your dock out into the middle of the lake for the day. They tend to be very common amongst folks who aren't really going out for moving around very much, but they're really stable, which makes them a great platform for folks who might have mobility issues or for young kids. And they tend to have some really great siding to help keep especially younger kids from leaning overboard and going overboard. They tend to be disliked just because they're not super maneuverable. They don't go very fast. Usually people are out there enjoying a really good time, which can be a nuisance to anyone in the area sometimes. Bleep Buck asks, how do boats float? Boats pretty much float on what is a displacement theory, using essentially formulations on density and taking up enough area to account for how much mass is there. So it's an equation on mass and volume. They displace water. So if you've ever taken like a Tupperware and put it in your bathtub, it's gonna float because it's spreading that area out across the water and sharing the weight across that. Boats do the same thing. Everything from the big ships to the little ones, they use displacement to float. Zex258 asks, anchor length for lakes, first time anchor buyer. You wanna make sure you have the right type of anchor for the location you're gonna be boating. So this is a mushroom anchor, which is great for kind of muddy or silty bottoms. It's gonna hold based largely on its weight. I usually wouldn't recommend a mushroom anchor for a boat, but it's great if you need to set something aside. So if you brought a raft with you or anything like that, this can be a super helpful tool. A slightly more common one that we see, especially for small boats, would be your Danforth anchor. It's not gonna be something that's gonna hold down our big old ship over here, but it absolutely will help with any of your small like recreational power boats. And what it does is it digs into sand, silt, but you wanna make sure first things first, you're getting the right anchor for the bottom you're gonna be anchoring on. You want enough chain to help kind of drag the anchor back. The amount of line you want is typically 5-to-1 for the depth of the lake you're gonna be boating in. Let's say you're boating in a lake that has 20 feet of depth. You need 100 feet of anchor line in order to safely anchor for the day. Cauliflower Nice 180. What are the top reasons people lose their vehicles? Most often it's because they forget their parking brake. When you're at the boat ramp, it's really important to not panic. Even if you're not totally sure you know what you're doing, make sure that you're taking those moments to breathe, utilizing your parking brake, not going too far down the ramp because you don't want your wheels on any slippery algae, and making sure that you have a trailer that's appropriately fitted to your car so that your car can actually pull it forward. Saratoshi asks, why don't ships have brakes? Because there's not enough friction between the boat and the water. Your car has brakes because when you try to stop the wheel, it has all that friction from the pavement and the roadway underneath. We don't have that same sort of grip. What we have instead is a lot of inertia, which is, if you remember, going back to high school physics here, right? A thing in motion wants to stay in motion. So your boat will actually try to continue moving in whatever direction you were moving in. In order to essentially stop it, you have to go in the opposite direction. So if you're going forward, you might have to use reverse to bring your boat to a stop. Jungle Jawa asks, how important is trim on a small outboard? So trim is really important on a small outboard. So trim refers to how your motor is positioned on the back of your boat. If, for example, this is your boat and you have an engine out the back, what you want to be thinking about is it trimmed up, which is usually how we store engines at the end of the day, or trimmed down? Now, when you're trying to go, you want to make sure that the propeller is all the way in the water. But we want to make sure that the hood of the engine is actually parallel to the water. If you over trim the boat in one direction, you'll drive the bow down. And if you under trim in this direction, you're actually going to drive the bow up. Both of those can make really unsafe conditions for the boat, either leading to submarining and swamping, or leading to your bow too high up, which reduces your visibility forward and can run the risk of hitting things or swamping out the stern. Next question is from a Reddit user. How common is capsizing? If you're taking into account what's happening that day with the weather and with the water, you should be able to avoid a capsize, especially if you're using the right size boat for the right size scenario. That being said, if you do find yourself in a capsize situation, it's really important to stay with or near your boat as long as it's safe to do so. A lot of people get the instinctual fear of, oh gosh, the boat's gone over, I need to get away from it. Unfortunately, what that means is if someone's coming up to assist and rescue you, they're now going to have to search for a little head floating nearby when their focus is probably on the big boat that has overturned. To help reduce the risk of collisions or getting run over, you should stay close to be able to wave down help. Rational asks, what's the most dangerous or extreme ocean? So that would be the Southern Ocean, 100%. That's gonna be the one with the most extreme conditions, the most dangerous waves. Boaters are gonna wanna enter that with a lot of caution. NP819 asks, what are the most important unwritten rules for boating? The most important ones are always having a good lookout. That is technically written, but I always need to reemphasize that one. When you're out on the water, it can be really easy to kind of fall into that false sense of security of, look at all this space. There's no yellow and white lines like when you're driving. Boats and people and animals and all these other wonderful things that float down the water sometimes can impact your day and turn a great day of boating into a really dangerous day of boating. And a good lookout is searching in all 360 degrees from the top of the boat. Not only where you're going, but what's coming behind you and what's coming at you from the sides. Aquara user asks, does a boat sit higher in salt water? Yes, salt water will definitely keep your boat floating a little higher. Salt water is heavier, so it'll create a lower displacement. So especially if you're in a smaller boat, you'll definitely feel that difference. The Wasps asks, how many different types of boats are there? Probably too many. So every manufacturer loves to come up with the newest, latest, and greatest. There's some gorgeous classic boats out there, but I would say the biggest thing to keep in mind is whether you're looking for a monohull, which has just one hull, a catamaran, which would have two hulls, or a trimaran, which has three. Make sure you keep in mind that different types of boats have different uses and purposes and different stability. You want to make sure you find the right one for where you are boating and what you're boating for. So Call Me Lovely asks, how fast do boats go? Some boats can go upwards of 100 miles per hour or even faster. Most frequently, the ones you're going to be interacting with are probably going to go about the speed of your car on a highway, and smaller boats will go slower. It really depends on the size of the boat. The current water speed record is 318 miles per hour. Bratherine asks, hey boaters, what is your cutoff for wind speed when considering whether or not to launch a boat for the day? One of the first things I check for is a small craft advisory, anywhere from 21 to 33 knots. And what that means is that the wind is definitely kicking up enough that if you're not a very experienced boater, you should be wary about heading out that day. The other thing to look for is if there's a gust advisory or warning. That could definitely urge some big caution, especially depending on the size and type of boat you're going out in. Ald Trader asks, outboard versus inboard. Outboard engines are engines that you can see. They're attached to the stern, the back of the boat. They're a little easier to do maintenance on, in my opinion, because you can walk right to the back of the boat, take the hood off, and check your engine. An inboard engine is going to be inside the boat. You need to make sure you're watching out for and being careful of any fume buildup. So you have blowers then on your boat to blow out any cavities in the boat. You're actually probably gonna go down into the cockpit or into the hold to check on that engine and do any maintenance. Wynn asks, what are the tips for dealing with seasickness? They do have all those cool fun gadgets like the glasses with the water in them and like motion sickness bracelets and things like that. All of those can be definitely great aids, but the first step I would recommend for anyone who knows they suffer from motion sickness would be making sure you're hydrated, making sure that you've had a good meal. I know that can seem a little counterintuitive, but really truly, if you've eaten a good meal and you are really well hydrated and you have a good eye for the horizon line, you're much less likely to get seasick. Dr. Gamble 6 asks, is red right returning not a thing anymore? It's still a thing. And when you're returning to port, what we're looking for are red and green channel markers. And the red ones, those are going to be triangular shaped or nun shaped. The green channel markers will be squares or hands. They actually look like big floating cylinders out in the water. When you're heading back into your safe harbor, the red ones should be on your right. On to the next. Jabasi asks, how do you go about understanding what different hull shape and motor sizes can do in different waters? You wouldn't want to take something like a skiff, which has a flat bottom, out into really heavy waters, because a flat bottom is going to slide across the water a lot easier than something like this, which has a much deeper cut from this center keel. The keel is the bottom of your boat, the area that kind of digs into the water the most. So different hull shapes have different looks to them. So this would be a shallow V. A deep V would dig much further down and be a much more severe V shape across the center of the boat. Something like a whaler would have something like a cathedral hull, like a cathedral shape upside down for different type of grip in different types of conditions. You definitely want to make sure that you're paying attention to what type of waters you're going to most often experience to determine what type of boat is going to be safest in that area. P. Nickby asks, when slip neighbors have trouble docking, should you ignore, stand ready, or actively offer help? If someone's in need, we should offer aid. But that being said, if you don't know if they need help, I wouldn't actively jump into a situation that you might put yourself at risk of getting hurt. I wouldn't necessarily ignore it, but I would stand ready in case they call out and say, hey, can you give us a hand here? Let's Be on the Boat says, has anyone traveled the Great Loop and how was it? Yes, people still travel the Great Loop. The Great Loop is essentially a giant loop that goes over and around the eastern waterways, so through the intercoastal system, down the eastern seaboard, and then up and around the edge of the Gulf of Mexico, and then up through the Mississippi River into the Great Lakes channels and the locks there. So if you make this big old loop, it'll take some time depending on the type of boat you're in. It's definitely a great way to get a good view on the United States from a different perspective. Leaf Buggy asks, is Haulover the most dangerous waterway in the US? So Haulover is based in Florida. It's an inlet, which means it's an entry point from open waters into inland waters. It's not the most dangerous, but it's definitely one of the ones that's most frequently filmed. There are several really dangerous inlets all around the United States. One of the ones that I frequently see mentioned as one of the more dangerous ones would be the Columbia River Bar along the border of Washington and Oregon, known as the boat graveyard of the Pacific. The dangerous piece about inlets is that's where there's a pinch point. So all the water rushing in or out as the tides change gets essentially funneled through that one point, which can create shifting sandbars. When a lot of water has to push through one tiny area, it can create some really dangerous currents and then also some really severe waves and backwash coming off the sides of the inlet. When that happens, you run the risk of getting into some pretty scary and sketchy situations. It's the Moose Man asks, how does a boat motor work and how does a small propeller move such a large object? Propellers work because they move so quickly. It's pulling enough water through that it's creating enough thrust to move big heavy objects. The size of the propeller should be the right fit for the right size boat, and there's usually some manufacturer recommendations for different boats on what you should be looking at in terms of horsepower and in terms of propeller size. Boat motors, most of the time nowadays, at least they're 4-stroke. They intake, they compress, they combust, and then they have an exhaust. So that's how they function. The River Shark asks, for those who occasionally host guests on their boat, what's an annoying recurring thing your guests do to annoy the crud out of you? So one of the most annoying things to have to do when you're on a boat is to constantly have to ask guests to get out of the way when you're going through a demanding maneuver, whether that's docking, getting out of a dock space, or going through a really tight area where there's a lot of boat traffic. One of the first things I always like to do is before I take a guest out on the boat, I explain to them where I need them to sit, especially when we're in those demanding areas where I have to be a little more maneuverable myself around the boat, or I need to be a little more on alert and pay attention to especially constrained areas. Undercover 500 asks, what's an unusual but handy item that every boater should have? My answer might surprise you, but I really love a good roll of E-tape. So electrical tape is really handy because it's waterproof. Duct tape is great and useful. It has its purposes, but it does tend to leave a lot of residue. Electrical tape will leave a little less residue and will do the job just as well. Also really great if you need to attach some things in the boat because it'll stick and it'll stay pretty waterproof. A Reddit user asks, how long until the swaying feeling goes away? So the swaying feeling that they're referring to is when you get off the boat and you still feel like you're on the boat. What it is it's reverse motion sickness. Essentially, it's land sickness. So your equilibrium, which is, how your body adjusts and feels to where you're situated in the world, still thinks it's on the boat and it hasn't quite settled back down yet. How long until it goes away? That varies on the person. All right, that's it. That's all the questions. I hope you learned something and we'll see you on the water.